Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Words of Heart podcast. I am your host, Dion Sanchez, and in this episode, it is just me speaking to you, my audience. It is my first solo episode of the new year. So if you are tuning in, Happy New Year! Happy New Year 2022, 2022. Ooh, ooh. Happy New Year, my audience. I am really excited for this new year, specifically for my podcast. For those of you who continue to listen, subscribe, and like and follow on the following platforms like the Words of Heart podcast on Facebook, and subscribe to my YouTube channel in wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Spotify, and Google. Thank you so much for your support and liking and subscribing and supporting my podcast and my vision. Because at the end of the day, no one should have to go through anything alone. And it truly warms my heart that my podcast is resonating with you and is making a profound impact, more of an impact than I can possibly predict or imagine. And it just astounds me that what I say to you is inspiring through my story, through my guests' stories, that it has connected with you in some profound way, whether it's your heart, your mind, or your spirit. I just truly, truly love that it's connecting with you and that it's relatable to you. And I just cannot be more grateful and overwhelmed at the amounts response you guys have given my podcast. And in regards to other exciting things in store for my podcast, I do have to share this. Some point in January, mid-January, my podcast, Words of Heart, and myself, your host, Dion Sanchez, will be featured in a magazine called Women Who Podcast. This magazine centers on female podcasters, and I'm just so excited of this opportunity to highlight my podcast and highlight myself as a host. And it's just, I started out this podcast with a little dream. It was a seed and a cell phone. I had no microphone. I had no good computer. I didn't have a lot. And and the fact that it has the chance to be featured in a magazine, it's just amazing and a huge blessing. And I'm so grateful that God has opened this platform to me to help others share their stories, to amplify other people's voices when the world may have silenced them. And everyone certainly know what it's like to deal with mental health, which is the whole focus of my podcast. And to think of where I was when I was younger and all the obstacles I have faced, and me thinking I'm not good enough or I am worthless or useless, or thinking what's the point of me being here, to come from that little girl who thought she had nothing to offer the world to now having a podcast, which is my own way of helping the world, is just amazing. And I'm just so excited that my podcast has the chance to be featured in a magazine, which has the potential to be read by millions. And I'm just so unbelievably excited. And I'm only been a year into podcasting, a year into it. And how many people can say they are like 1 year podcaster and is featured in a magazine? Like, how many people can say that? And am so happy that God just opened this platform to me. And I love that my podcast is making a difference and is making an impact. And I have my own little podcast station, as you can tell, with my little cool chair like a boss. Anyhow, the point of the matter is I am so grateful for the opportunity to be featured in the magazine called Women Who Podcast. And for the staff and writers of the magazine Women Who Podcast, if you are listening to this, thank you so much, so much. An outpouring of love and gratitude for the opportunity to highlight my podcast, Words of Heart, because I just couldn't be more grateful for that. So thank you, Women Who Podcast magazine. If you are listening to this, thank you, my listeners and subscribers, for supporting my podcast as much as you do. It astounds me how much of an impact this podcast has made and continues to make. So I'm excited for what's in store for my podcast this year. There are many podcast episodes in the works. I have many episodes scheduled. I just finished a podcast episode earlier, which I may be releasing earlier this evening or later this evening, depending. I do have to go back to work tomorrow, but I just wanted to do this episode, this new year episode in a way, about my excitement and ambitions for this podcast. I do hope to appear on other podcasts to share my story and to advocate for mental health, since it's such a fundamental part of my story. And I'm excited to appear on some podcasts coming up. One of them is called The Wandering Mind, and that will be happening sometime next week, along with Quest for Inspiration, or I think it's Quest for a New Inspiration podcast. My apologies if I mispronounced that. I'm excited to appear on other podcasts and advocate mental health through my own personal story. And I find it to be important to advocate that. As I've mentioned before, I do consider myself a warrior for change, and I want to exemplify that and reflect that in everything I do. And I'm just so unbelievably excited. And there are some podcast collaborations in the works. One of them is with No More Late Fees, the 90s and 2000s podcast. It centers on movies, so I'm really excited about that. And shout out to you guys as well. I can't wait for us to get that to happen. And again, if you are a listener, if you are a subscriber, if you are a hardcore fan of the Words of Fire podcast, here are some of the ways that you can continue to support my podcast. Again, for those of you who have supported it, thank you so much. To extend the support or show any support whatsoever, if you could please do the following, that would mean so much, because at the end of the day, I want my podcast to reach people. I want it to make an impact. If you feel like this podcast can resonate with someone, tell them. If you could like my Facebook page, Words of Fire Podcast, and follow it on Facebook, that would be awesome. If you could subscribe on the YouTube channel, that would be awesome as well. And if you could subscribe or retweet any of the episodes, that would be equally as awesome as well. And if you have a cellular device, a cell phone such as this, oh, look at that beautiful girl right there. Anyhow, if you have a cell phone, any cellular device of any capacity. I know some people who are listening to this may not have access to technology, so you simply listening is fine. But those of you who do have access to technology, go to Apple Podcasts, leave a review and rating of the Words of Fire podcast. If you're on Spotify, leave a rating. If you're on Podchaser, which is a podcast affiliated website, you can leave a rating on that website as well. Wherever you listen to your podcast, if you have the capacity to leave a review or rating of the Words of Fire podcast, please do so. Again, my vision is to help others through my platform by sharing my story, through sharing other people's stories, such as my guests who have the capacity to who have overcame so much. And I'm just so honored and blessed that they've had the courage and strength to be willing to share their story on my podcast. And because they share the same vision as I do, as they feel their story can help others, which it certainly does. Because at the end of the day, no one should have to go through anything alone. So for all my listeners and supporters, thank you so much. Continue tuning into every single episode of the Words of Fire podcast. If you are familiar with the magazine, Women Who Podcast Magazine, feel free to buy an issue or buy however that works, and check out the Words of Fire podcast featured in the January issue, which should come out in mid-January. I'm not entirely sure which day, but I'm super excited. And if you could buy an issue, if you are listening to this podcast on the moon, I know I've said this in every single episode, but I'm a huge nerd at heart. Star Trek, Star Wars, which are completely two different mediums, but again, a nerd nonetheless. So if you are listening to this on the moon, please, please, please let me know. I find the idea of this podcast not just reaching my galaxy, my Earth, my universe, my dimension in time. I want this podcast to reach other dimensions, other universes, other galaxies that have yet to be discovered. I want that to happen. So if you are listening to it from the moon, please make contact. Seriously, I want my podcast to continue making an impact from here and beyond. So I am super excited for what's in store for this podcast, Words of Heart. If you enjoyed this random episode, feel free to let me know on the following platforms, which here they are again. You can find us at the Words of Heart podcast on Facebook. You can find us on YouTube under the same name, and wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Spotify, Google, the list goes on and on as to where you can tune into this podcast. But again, feel free to let me know about any of your thoughts or how this podcast has resonated with you. I'm on Twitter at HeartWarrior24 and on Instagram at HeartWarrior25. And if you yourself wants to be a guest on my podcast, if you have a story that has the power to help others, or if you just want to share your own experience for whatever reason, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to amplify your voice. The world has a tendency to silence our voices. I will not silence you. I will not judge you. This podcast is an open form of comfort and acceptance, period. So much love to you, my listeners and supporters. Thank you so much for everything you have done in regards to my podcast and supporting it. So until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and be sure to tune into the next episode of the Words of Heart podcast. Bye.